Hello, my GOPO little patriots. Welcome back to government. We are going to talk today about the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. So, the civil rights movement was in like the 50s and 60s, and it kind of started off with the Supreme Court when they basically ended a bunch of discriminatory practices like one of them would be like white primaries where only white people could vote in the South. And then we're eventually, and of course, the Brown versus Board decision. But other branches didn't get on board as quickly. We saw a few things here and there, like when Eisenhower helped the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas go to school. It was Black kids going to a white school, and he sent troops down to help it happen. We did see Congress get involved with the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first piece of civil rights activation legislation since Reconstruction, but like it wasn't enforced that well. So we start seeing, since there were some signs of civil rights being promoted for the Black community, but not much being done, we start seeing a grassroots movement. This is where we see the theory of democracy, the participatory government, where there's a social movement happening where it's just a large group of citizens that are moving for the political change, which was the civil rights movement. Who led this? Not just Martin Luther King, but lots of different African American activists in the community. And one of the ways they fought it was with the idea of civil disobedience. This is something that came from Henry David Thoreau, and then Gandhi was famous for using it, where basically you peacefully refuse to obey a law in order to call attention to its injustice. So one example would be like the Montgomery bus boycott. So it was planned with Rosa Parks. She was on a segregated bus where the Blacks had to sit in the back and the whites were sitting in the front. And she sat in the front and refused to give up her seat. And when she didn't, she got arrested for it. So this led to the Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and people just the Black community said, we are going to boycott the buses and riding the buses. Well, that's awesome. It's a very easy way. So the civil disobedience was from Rosa Parks. She broke the law to show the injustice. And then Dr. Martin Luther King and others in the Black community in Montgomery messed with their economy. They refused to ride the bus, and that really hurt their the business. And they did it. It took a while, it lasted for a year, but it brought attention to what happened. And then the courts declared that law about the segregated seats on the bus unconstitutional. So it was successful. So that's where Dr. Martin Luther King got his notoriety from, was helping start the Montgomery bus boycott. But what are some other things about him? Well, he was one of the founders. His group was known as the SCLC, and their main goal was to challenge racial segregation and promote civil rights. He was constantly faced with threats of violence. He was imprisoned. Actually, we're going to read his letters from the Birmingham jail later. All he promoted, his number one promotion was peace. You do it through peaceful manner, and he was one that was for integration. Okay, I'm going to skip that because you're going to read that later. And we'll talk about it the next time we're in class together. All right. So Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, they definitely got notoriety. They definitely brought attention to the problems in the South. And with that, we start seeing more and more boycotts, more and more activism, which is going to lead to two of the greatest pieces of legislation ever passed in American history. So some other examples of civil disobedience that happened in the South were the sit-ins in Greensboro, where they would sit in like Woolworths. It's like a restaurant that only let white people in, and they would sit at the counters. Again, civil disobedience. The SNCC or SNCC, they organized protests. You had the Freedom Riders, who would challenge any type of segregated transportation. And what helped their cause, I mean, this is bad, but it helped. They were beaten, they were attacked, not only by other citizens, but even police. Police would use fire hoses on the protest. People would use police would use dogs to attack them in their protests. And this was in television, this was in photographs, and it was shown all over the country. And people started to get really upset by it. And more people were on board with helping the civil rights movement, which eventually led to the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. So the Civil Rights Act of 64 basically said any type of segregation, discrimination in any place, public accommodations, restaurants, hotels, any of that kind of stuff cannot be done. You cannot do it anymore. It is illegal. And it wasn't, and the thing is, I'm specifically talking about the Civil Rights Act for race, but it covered everything: race, gender, ethnicity, sex, national origin, everything. Now, this is for segregation. 1 year later, they passed the Voting Rights Act that said if you're discriminatory in any way with someone's right to vote, it's over. You can't do it. So no more white primaries, grandfather clause, poll taxes, all of that kind of stuff, literacy tests. So the Civil Rights Act was super successful, which eventually led to the second wave of the fight for women's rights. Now, the first wave of the fight for women's rights kind of started in the 1840s and then stopped around 1920. So in the 1840s, you have women fighting for temperance, which is, banning alcohol. It was more of like, hey, our husbands are beating us and they're drunk. We want to stop them from doing that. And then they moved on to the abolition movement, and they were fighting for that. But then a couple of famous women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, went over to the worldwide abolitionist conference in London, and they went to walk in the door, and they're like, yeah, you're women, so go away. So they're like, okay, well, let's start fighting for women's rights. And they started doing that in like the late 1840s. And we see that it took a while to finally get one of the biggest things they pushed for, which was the right to vote. Now, states have been giving women the right to vote all over the country, but it wasn't until the 19th Amendment where all women everywhere had the right to vote in both federal and state elections. So that was, and that's when like the first wave ended. And then in the 1960s, once they saw the success of the civil rights movement, is when we see the second wave. And their goal was basically changing laws, dealing with the inequalities at work and at home, and dealing with sexual harassment and violence. And it started with kind of the catalyst of it was this book by Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique, where basically it was this idea of, she interviewed a bunch of her college friends and roommates and stuff, and they were like kind of like the typical housewife that you would think of in the 50s, like at home, husband's at work, white picket fence, 3 kids, dog, and they weren't satisfied. She posed the question, that the famous question at the time, is it all? Where they felt like they weren't fulfilling what they wanted to do in life. So this kind of catalyzed the movement in the 1960s, as well as the civil rights movement. And we start seeing a push for women's equality. And we saw some success with that. First, the organization that was the most famous with helping this and ending discrimination in the workplace and sexual harassment in the workplace was NOW, or the National Organization of Women. Like I said, with the Civil Rights Act of 64, it not only protected African Americans or people of color, but it also protected women. We also saw in the 1970s Title IX passed, which basically says that if you are a public school and you're receiving federal funds, you have to have one female sport for every male sport. And if you don't, you can have females playing for that. So like wrestling, for instance, or like soccer at Sandwich. Another thing they tried to pass during the second wave was the Equal Rights Amendment. It was actually first proposed in 1923 by Alice Paul, but people are like, no, we're kind of over women's rights right now. So they tried it again. They're like, hey, let's do this. So basically this amendment said equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of sex. So basically, what does that mean? It means that they were trying to make laws where you can't, the word, gender, sex is not a part of any of it. Congress passed it, but only 35 of the 38 states passed it, so it failed to pass. So a lot of people didn't like it because they felt the reason, like the people who are against it, people who are for it, they're like equal rights for women completely. Don't what's the word I'm looking for? Don't distinguish between male and female in any law. And other people who were against it were like, no, it takes away some of the protections that women get with like divorce or with like any type of like violence in the home or anything like that. And then probably the biggest one is women would have to be in the draft if this got passed too. One last thing, what was with the second wave of women's rights, we see a lot of court cases that kind of described how to define gender discrimination and sexual harassment. So when doing this, they have to use this term called strict scrutiny, which means that a government has to show a compelling interest to justify unequal treatment. So what that is saying is you cannot have gender discrimination unless there is some type of compelling interest to justify it. So a really good example of that would be the draft. Women are not drafted. They do have a compelling interest to justify it. There's also the rational basis standard, where there's differential treatment that must be shown to be reasonable and not arbitrary. So the example I always use with this is, let's suppose all the male PE teachers were to quit today. It's okay, and it's not gender discrimination if the school district were to post a job opening for a male PE teacher because of locker room supervision. That's a reasonable reason for differential treatment. So most forms of treatment differentiating gender or race are found to be unconstitutional, but every now and then you have rational basis standard or a government compelling interest to have gender discrimination. I mean, that's about it, to be honest. You rarely can find that anymore. All right, so that is it for chapter 9. I will see you guys later.